Okay, hello everyone. It is 12:03, so we'll just go ahead and get started now. Thank you for joining in. I'm really excited about our webinar today because we, as you all know, are being joined by Anjali, who is coming from all the way, joining us from Madrid, which I believe is 9 hours ahead. So huge thank you in advance to Anjali for um, for doing very long days over there in Madrid at COP25. So I will just say a few words and do a bit of housekeeping before we get started. This is a 1 hour webinar and it'll start after I do an intro. It'll start with Anjali giving a presentation for about 25 minutes, and then we'll go into question and answer for the last half. So if you haven't already, please find the chat box. For me on my screen, there's a chat button towards the bottom, and if I click that, then chat pops up over on the right hand side. So I encourage folks to type in questions there for Anjali, and then when we get to the question and answer, hopefully she'll have a chance to answer those all. I'm calling in here from my home. I'm in Duncan, BC, on unceded Cowichan territory. And of course, Anjali's calling in from Madrid. Anjali is our newest member at Sierra Club BC, rather our newest staff member. She's our climate justice campaigner. I'm really excited personally to be working with Anjali. Our paths have crossed a few times over the last few years in climate change and climate justice work, and I have a huge amount of respect for Anjali. If you haven't already been following her, you can follow her almost daily on social media. If you go to Sierra Club BC's Facebook or Instagram feeds, you can see video updates from Anjali, and I've really enjoyed getting those updates. So thanks already for that, Anjali. I'm going to pass it over to you. We did a quick little check-in, so I know that you you've been lucky enough to find a desk in all the craziness of COP25. But thank you so much, Anjali, and oh, it looks like you've unmuted yourself, so take it away.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. It is so great to be on my first Sierra Club webinar. And thank you so much to Galen for that really, really lovely introduction you just gave me. So yeah, I mean, it's a small enough group that I think we can just really be interactive and have a really good conversation and get into the issues that you want to get into. So I thought I'll just start off by walking you through basically some of the issues that strike to the core of what these negotiations are about. So just a little bit of background on where I am. So the United Nations, it's called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. We fondly call it the UNFCCC because that acronym is just so long. And it was founded in 1992 in Rio at the Earth Summit. And basically the ultimate aim of the UN Convention, the UNFCCC, is to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere and to stop anthropogenic climate change, and to keep those emissions below dangerous levels. And so, so founded in '92, so we are, almost at 30 years of these negotiations. And the aim of them was supposed to come up with a binding global climate deal. And so they've gotten pretty close on several occasions, and we still haven't achieved that. The most recent close call was in Paris in 2015, where the world's governments, to much applause and media, agreed to the Paris Agreement, which is a global, non-binding, but still global agreement to reduce emissions. Unfortunately, one of the largest players in the Paris Agreement, the United States, recently made their first move to pull out of the agreement, which is a big blow to the global community because these negotiations they're not binding because it would just be far too difficult and threatening for countries to actually agree to legal measures. So it's more of a good faith exercise, and it's one of the last remaining, true tests of like our multilateral process, which is we have this global emergency that we have all agreed that the science is very real and very immediate, and we even have a global scientific body, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And so it's this good faith exercise of, can we all get together and figure out something that's fair for all of us? And so when I say the word fair, that really is the heart of what the UN negotiations are about. It's about justice and about fairness. And so the metaphor that I like to use for this, before I'll show you some, I'll talk at you less, and I'll show you some cool visuals that might be able to illustrate what I'm talking about better. But the metaphor that I use for this is a pie. So if we think of our atmosphere or our atmospheric space as a pie, essentially your piece of the pie is the amount of atmospheric space that you have the right to. So one kind of framing that has been introduced in these talks is that atmospheric space is like a human right. It's like the human right to food, water, shelter, all those other human rights. Every human has the right to atmospheric space, because the way that emissions work right now, the more your emissions, the higher your level of development, or the higher your level of economic growth. And obviously that's something that we're trying to break with the development of renewable technologies and so on and so forth. But right now, emissions equals development and a higher quality of life. And so it's about how big a piece of that pie can each country take for themselves. And the rules of sharing that pie depend on your historical role in creating climate crisis, your current role in perpetuating the climate crisis and contributing to it, and your sort of positionality in the world in terms of like privilege and wealth and quality of life. So all of these being taken into account, how do we share the burden of reducing our emissions? Because we need to get to a carbon neutral world by 2050 if we're going to avoid a lot of the major runaway benchmarks that the science tells us. So to start off with, I think it would be good for us to simply start off with a little bit of the science and where we find ourselves right now at this moment in time in the negotiations. So I'm going to share with you the screen. So the United Nations Environment Program releases this report called the Emissions Gap Report every year. This year, it just got released a month or two ago. And essentially, this report tells us the state of play. This is where our emissions are at. This is where we need to go. And there's a gap between where we need to go and where we're at. And this is what needs to happen to fill that gap. So it's a very useful report, and they've made a nice visual for us. So I thought instead of me talking about it, I can just show you the visual. Apologies, this presentation is going to take place on my browser. So that's just how it had to be running around at the conference. We take shortcuts. So this year's report was quite a damning one, because it basically says we have not taken nearly enough action for the last decade. And because of that, we've created a very, very small window of opportunity to actually reach our global target. Can I just actually get a, because I don't actually, there's so many of you, and I don't know everybody's level of, how, to what extent you've been following the issue. So does the 1.5 degrees Celsius number mean anything to people? Maybe you can chat or just put your hand up or nod or something like that. Yes, so, okay, I'm seeing some nods. So people are saying that they know that 1.5, where that 1.5 number comes from. Okay. Well, so I didn't hear from a couple of you, so I'll just make it really quick. Basically, Yes, you're right, whoever put stuff in the chat. In Paris in 2015, all the countries of the world agreed that our global target would be 1.5 degrees Celsius. And that is 1.5 degrees Celsius of average global warming from pre-industrial times. So that number represents our anthropogenic contribution to total global warming. And it sounds like a very small number, 1.5 degrees, not that much. However, on a global scale, 1.5 degrees of warming actually represents a whole ton of chaos and a whole ton of climate impacts and a lot of lives lost and a lot of livelihoods lost. So as much as we can to keep it under 1.5 is what we're aiming for. Right now, we have already reached about 1.1. So let me go through this. So the UNEP Gap report says exactly what you see here. We're on the brink of missing the opportunity to limit global warming to 1.5. We are actually on a pathway to past 3 degrees of warming. Some of the models say that we're on the pathway to 4 degrees. Some say we're on the pathway to 7 degrees. All of those are totally chaotic scenarios. So the gap between where we're at and where we need to go is immediate. And so every single country in the world needs to get on a decarbonization pathway right now. So the report gives us these 4 critical numbers. 1.5, we already went through that. 1.5 is the absolute maximum. In fact, a lot of governments, when they were debating what this target would look like, small island state governments and sort of the least developed countries in the world said, listen, 1 degree of warming is already devastating for our economies and our people. 1.5 degrees already means that some countries are going underwater and a lot of coastlines will be lost and coastal cities will be majorly disrupted. So 1.5 is already pretty high. So in order to get to 1.5, or in order to stay below 1.5, we need to drop 25 gigatons of emissions by 2030. That's 10 years. However, our current pathway is 56 gigatons, which is double the number that we need. So the ambition gap from where we are currently to 1.5 degrees means total global emissions reductions have to be 7.6% every single year between 2020 and 2030, which is quite a lot. So 7.6 is our pie now. So 7.6% is amongst all the countries in the world. So we need to divide up that percentage per country. How much of that 7.6% is Canada supposed to take on? So this is a little graphic that talks about what we call the lost decade from 2010 to 2030. If we'd actually taken the necessary climate action 10 years ago, this 7.6% that we need to reduce every year for the next 10 years would only have been 3.3%. So by not taking significant climate action for 10 years, we turned it into 7.6. And if we don't take significant climate action for the next 10 years, or for the next 5 years, we're gonna turn it to 15.4. So these are all scenarios that basically underscore the same point, which is that we cannot afford to delay action any further. So I want to talk about what this figure, 7.6%, means for Canada, because what we say is that every nation in the world has a fair share of emissions reductions that they need to reach. And so what is Canada's fair share? Well, actually, some new data has come out literally just a few weeks ago. Sierra Club posted it on our Facebook page, and we will do so again, because I think it's really important to understand what Canada's fair share is. This is the actual numbers on what our fair share would include. So I'm just going to start with this, go to something else, and come back to this. Overall, Canada's fair share has 2 big pieces, the red and the blue. I'm scrolling through, not in huge detail, because we're going to come back to this. But basically, the red and the blue are the two halves of our fair share. And the first half is our domestic work, everything we need to do to reduce emissions at home. And the second half is our international work. And both of those are equally important pieces of the puzzle and of our fair share. And we don't actually hear a lot about this blue piece, our international obligations, in the climate discourse in Canada. And that's one thing that I want to draw more attention to, because our international obligations are super important for a number of reasons. One, because Canada is a current high polluter. And I will send you guys these websites. So I just received a request to have access. I will send these websites through Galen to you guys afterwards, so you can access all this data after. These are just sites that have all this information for you. So the reasons that we have this international component to our fair share is because historically Canada contributed a lot to climate change through our process of industrial development. And that process of industrial development gave us this great quality of life that we enjoy today. And that great quality of life is what enables us to give back to the global community. Secondly, Canada also has very, very, very high per capita emissions. So basically, every Canadian has a very large piece of the atmospheric pie. We enjoy a high quality of life, and we emit more per person than most of the rest of the world. And so because of these factors, part of our fair share includes giving back to the global community, specifically the developing world. And that happens in a number of ways. It happens through finance, and there's a big finance piece. I'll just highlight it here. It's right over here, if you can see my mouse. Our fair share, it includes finance transfers of about 4 billion USD annually from 2020 to 2030, which is a lot of money. It also includes transfers of technology, clean technology. Something that's not very known is that a lot, or the vast majority, of the intellectual property rights, so the patents for renewable technology, reside in the global north, so in countries like basically the US and Canada. And so a huge barrier to developing countries being able to switch to a clean development pathway is because of those intellectual property rights and the lack of access to those patents. So part of our Canada's fair share is passing renewable technology to the global south so that they don't have to develop through the same sort of dirty industrial development that Canada did. And then the third thing is capacity building. So to use all that renewable technology and to be able to get on a low carbon pathway, all of this is part of our fair share. So just to show you a little bit of, so we talked about the gap, the emissions gap, where we need to be and where we are. This visual is a very simple visual that kind of sketches out who plans to actually do their share. So this is based on national commitments under the Paris Agreement. Basically, every country committed to a number of emissions reductions, and most of those commitments were far off from what their fair share of emissions reductions would be. So you can just get a super quick visual here. The US and parts of Europe, severely insufficient emissions reductions pledges. Canada, also insufficient. Got a few, good scenarios here and there, but largely the Paris Agreement voluntary commitments from countries didn't get us anywhere close to the 1.5 goal. Now, if you think about it, every nation that isn't doing its fair share means that all the other nations have to compensate. So we already have a very, very steep fair share. So, and our national commitments, Canada's climate plan, is nowhere close to that fair share. So we already have a long way to go to even meet our fair share. Now, if a country like the US refuses to do its fair share and kind of ignores that international obligation, that means the burden on the rest of us is much greater. All right, this is kind of a cool interactive map. I don't know if you guys have seen this before. It's just carbonmap.org, and it is a good visual for why some countries' fair shares include these very strong international commitments, and what that means. So you can change the shading on this map. I've set it to carbon emissions per person. So the darker the color, the more emissions per capita, per person. So as you can see, we're pretty dark up here, Canada and the US, and Europe is pretty, middle of the way to dark. The Gulf also pretty dark. Most of the global South, India, and most of Africa and most of South America are not that high on the per capita emissions chart. So first, if we go to population size per country, the map changes and we see that the countries that have the most population are kind of here, mostly Asia. Then if we go to wealth, the map literally reverses. These are the countries with the most wealth. Now, if we go to emissions, these are current emissions, not per capita, but as a total country. So you kind of have to keep the per capita thing in mind because, so China's pretty swollen on this map, so is the US. However, the US is way darker, which means its per capita emissions are way higher. China has, 1.4 billion people or whatever. So those are things to keep in mind. Now, if we go to historical emissions, most of the global South really shrinks because the developed world is really where most of the historical emissions are. So Europe is huge on this map, and the United States is huge. Canada is not as huge, but it's definitely bigger than almost the entire continent of South America. So we've definitely contributed quite a big portion to historical emissions. And then, so if you look at these historical emissions, and then if you go to the people at risk map, this is basically climate vulnerability, people who are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. The map literally reverses, and we see that a lot of Asia and Africa are in the pathway of the worst climate impacts. So these are all the issues of equity and fairness and justice that countries are grappling with at the table at these talks, because all of these factors that I showed you on this map are what goes into play when we figure out what our fair shares are and what each country is going to contribute. So I'll wrap up in about 5 minutes, but I just wanted to walk you through some of the actual policy issues on the table at these talks. So these are the high-level justice issues, and they manifest themselves in these very specific ways. So, oh, sorry, this is just another visual for that. These are visual scenarios of climate impacts. So this is the cumulative risks of 1.5 degrees, which is our global target. And basically, the darker dots on the map show more vulnerability to these impacts of climate change, heat waves and flooding, sea level rise, crop failure, and things like that. So that's the scenario at 1.5 degrees. That's the scenario at 2 degrees. So you can see that the impacts are more concentrated in the south, in South America, the lower part of North America, a lot in Asia, and a lot in Africa. And then this is 3 degrees. This is a 3-degree world. The impacts, again, are very concentrated in the global south. And we look pretty okay on this map up in Canada, but our friends in the global south do not. So that's just another visual. So I could break down kind of the big issues that people are fighting over on the table into 2 to 3 major issues. Obviously, there's way more. There is and I'm going to do it through showing you some of the actions that civil society has actually sort of undertaken these creative actions every day. So, what the COP looks like is meeting rooms, private meeting rooms, governments negotiating, civil society, which includes all non-government, which includes me. Yellow badge means civil society. We are either sitting in on the negotiations that we're allowed to sit in on, or we are planning creative actions to let governments know where we stand on the issues, or we're hosting side events, press conferences, all sorts of gatherings. The COP is just a really, really colorful space where civil society from all over the world gets to come and talk about these ideas together. So I'll show you some of these creative actions, and they actually get at a lot of the issues on the table. So this is my friend Dipti. She's from Mozambique. And this was a big creative action to protest this thing known as Article 6. And Article 6 in the convention text refers to a number of issues, but the main issue on the table is carbon markets. So when we say we need to reduce our emissions by 2050, I mean like actual emissions cuts. But in the convention, there's sort of two pathways to emissions reductions that are outlined. One is non-market mechanisms, which are quote unquote real emissions reductions, and one is market mechanisms, which are a lot to do with offsets and sort of credit schemes and cap and trade, anything that involves a market to incentivize people to reduce their emissions. And carbon markets are hotly contested. They are one of the most volatile issues on the table at these talks, because where they have been tested, so there is a huge carbon market where Europe is the highest participant, and that's called a Clean Development Mechanism. So you can check it out, the CDM. And the CDM is a market mechanism that countries across Europe participate in the most, but other countries as well can participate. And essentially, it's a system of emissions trading and offsets. And that received major blowback because it was riddled with loopholes. And essentially, emissions at the end of the day were allowed to increase by around 6%. When the goal of the mechanism was actually to reduce emissions. There's too many loopholes, and so they're very faulty the way they're designed right now. Another huge critique of carbon markets is indigenous land grabs. So carbon markets have required larger swaths of land, and those have been grabbed from indigenous peoples, which leads to the other main concern of them, which is human rights abuses. There's a lot of human rights abuses that go hand in hand with carbon markets and are incentivized because large corporations need to reduce their emissions no matter what, and or trade their emissions or buy their emissions or whatever it is. And so basically anything that's not involved in the market gets trampled in that process. And usually the first things to get trampled are indigenous rights and human rights. So here's a bunch of people protesting carbon markets in Article 6. This is kind of a creative visual. The blue represents the waters and the clouds and the trees, and their slogan that they were chanting was, "The sky is not for sale. The sky is not for sale." And it was kind of a beautiful, they did a sort of reenactment. So these people on the left represent government and industry, and the people on the right with their hands up represent indigenous peoples and local communities who are having their lands taken from them and polluted upon through carbon market trading schemes. So they did this whole kind of enactment, and basically the end of the action was the people of the world being able to push back against carbon markets, which was really cool. Okay, well, I was going to say this for the end, but I guess we'll just talk about it. So you guys are familiar with the Fridays for Future movement, kind of founded by Greta Thunberg, who's here in Madrid. She's been joining some of these creative actions that I'm about to show you. And so there was a large Fridays for Future march on Friday in Madrid, and it brought out 500,000 people. And with all kinds of messaging, but a large theme through it was capitalism and the climate don't mix. And so you see all that. It was a crazy, insane, and beautiful gathering of people in Madrid on Friday night. And it ended with a bunch of speeches, and indigenous people ended off the night with their statement, which is really cool. Great positive visual. Yes, thank you. I know there was a lot of doom and gloom at the beginning, but I'm ending with these on purpose because the people power at COPs is why I attend these. There's so much tremendous hope, even when it seems like, we can't possibly reach our targets and we can't possibly save the sinking ship. People come out and they have so much hope that it gives me hope. RED, we can talk about RED later, but this is a fight that has been ongoing at the UNFCCC for decades. And basically, RED is a market mechanism to reduce emissions, basically through deforestation. It's basically created intense deforestation, mostly on indigenous lands around the world. So I think these are representatives from Amazonian groups who have been opposing RED on the ground for, like I said, decades. This is actually a very sad fight. Sorry, we went from positive to negative. RED has been a long-standing fight for people's lives, basically. And as the negotiators are debating whether to include and allow carbon markets in the text, which I'm afraid it's kind of inevitable that carbon markets are a part of the convention text. They've been devastating people through programs like RED for decades. And well, we could do a whole other webinar on RED. This is another action. This action was related to kicking out coal, because coal, as you know, is the dirtiest form of energy. And so it was just telling countries like India and Japan and the United States to get off coal, basically, and not to present LNG or natural gas or any of these other fossil fuel-based solutions as alternatives to coal, but just to really just phase off coal. So let's see here. This is more from the anti-coal action. Another big issue at the COP has been this issue of basically for the past few years, corporate polluters having a huge presence in these talks. And that is, a lot of people see this as just a fundamental conflict of interest and a total violation of what is supposed to be, what I was saying before, like a good faith negotiating space. And to allow corporations to sponsor portions of the talks and to, be able to lobby the governments at the table for these talks is seen by many as an unacceptable conflict of interest. And so there's been a campaign that's gained a lot of traction in recent years to kick the big polluters out of the talks. And also we've seen in the last sort of 5 to 10 years is more of a focus on, yes, still pressuring countries to reduce their emissions, but also pressuring countries to stop subsidizing the global fossil fuel industry, because the fossil fuel industry remains our greatest obstacle to emissions reductions and to the fundamental restructuring of our economies that is actually required to bring our emissions down. Because the global subsidies to the fossil fuel industry, some numbers say like it's well into the trillions, like 7 trillion or something like that. Canada's annual subsidy to the industry are around 60 billion by some estimates annual. And it's these subsidies that are enabling the industry to have the grip on our economy that they currently have. And so this particular action was, it was about taking big polluters out, but then it was also about funding solutions, not polluters. If we invested that 60 billion into the renewable sector and into restructuring our economy to provide better services to people like public transport and healthcare and things that reduce the impacts of climate change on people, then we wouldn't have this dilemma. We wouldn't be so far behind on our climate commitments. Let's see if there's more photos from this. Yeah, and the tagline is "Make them pay," and it's actually kind of powerful because you can see what we want them to pay for. So here, make them pay for decades of deception. We know the fossil fuel industry has deceived the public for decades. They knew about climate change in the late 1950s. And throughout the decades that followed, they had the best climate scientists in the world. They had the best climate models in the world, and they knew exactly the link between fossil fuels and emissions. And yet they invested millions and millions of dollars into basically covering up the science or funding climate denial groups or encouraging a lack of faith in the climate science. So decades of deception. This little thing up here, loss and damage, is another major issue on the table that I'm afraid I've been talking for way longer than I was supposed to. So I don't know if I can get into loss and damage, but that's probably the other major policy area. In addition to carbon markets, loss and damage is the other big area. And loss and damage in a nutshell, and I can pass on some good resources about it after, but loss and damage is what happens when a community cannot adapt to climate change anymore. And there's just real losses and damages. So when you have a cyclone like Hurricane Idai that just hit Mozambique, where I think 1,500 people died, and the country had to take out a $150 million loan from the IMF. That put them further into debt to deal with those climate impacts. That's loss and damage. That's when no amount of money can make up for the damage that was done. And so there needs to be compensation for the things that cannot be brought back. And so loss and damage is mostly owed to the least developed countries who were not responsible for the crisis at all, and yet are losing immense life, culture, ways of living, traditions, land space, wealth, all kinds of things due to climate change. So that's the other big issue on the table. Here's, this is kind of what life at COP looks like, press conferences that civil society puts on to talk about some of the issues on the table. You can see on his slide up there, it talks about geoengineering, which is another thing that's very volatile and contested. It kind of goes hand in hand with carbon markets. Civil society does not want geoengineering. Let's see, carbon markets. Yeah, so these are I could go on and on with these photos. There's so much to say. Actually, there's a really funny tradition at COP, and this is an Indigenous youth delegation from the U.S. It's an all-Indigenous delegation, and we sort of put them front and center at this action, and they did this very powerful chant at the end, which was very beautiful. What was I saying? Oh yeah, so there's a funny tradition at the COPs. Yeah, so this is the last thing I'll say before I end my talking head piece. And we call it Fossil of the Day. And it's basically, this fake awards ceremony that is done to the tune of the Jurassic Park theme song. And every day during the COP, three countries are awarded a Fossil of the Day award, and that is sort of a sarcastic award to the countries that did the most to block progress that day in the talks. So right before this webinar, I came from the Fossil of the Day award ceremony, and Canada won today. one of the 3 awards for going ahead with the tech frontier mine that Indigenous groups have been resisting for so long, which totally blows our fair share targets out of the water. So yeah, on that note, I will end the share. Oops.
Great. Thank you so much, Anjali. Really awesome to get both the context of the reminder of where we're really at. We need to be reminded of that, the reality of the numbers, and as you were saying earlier on in the presentation, our failure to act so far, and what we need to do to act now to reduce emissions. And then I love seeing these pictures of your time there. And actually, we'll just go to the first question, which is Patricia Lane. And I'm going to unmute you, Patricia, so you can go ahead and ask it. I think it's been partially answered, but maybe there's more.
Thanks, Anjali. Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you.
So just for those of us who've been watching COP for decades, can you just tell us what you do in a day? Like, does your day start at 5 o'clock in the morning, or do you get up and have a nice breakfast, or and why are you there? Like, I get that you would be there for solidarity and inspiration, but do you actually think that civil society makes a difference, and what's your particular strategy around that?
That's a great question. And I think it's on our minds every year when you leave a COP. You're like, this feels really hard. Are we doing the right thing? So here's how kind of I understand it, and for myself. So basically, for civil society, there's different constituencies under the UN. And they are, so there's like a women and gender constituency, there's a farmers constituency, there's a youth constituency, and there is a constituency for ENGOs, environmental NGOs, which we actually have 2 halves of that. So I'm on the coordinating committee for one half of the ENGO constituency, which means that we coordinate ENGO actions at the COP and throughout the year. We kind of coordinate the ENGO presence. And I find this to be, first of all, really valuable for a number of reasons. One is that a lot of the ENGOs that we work with are very close to their country negotiators. So Canada has, a huge negotiating team, hundreds of people. A lot of countries only come with 2 or 3 people, some of them only 1 person. And so they really rely on the ENGOs for information and framing, and to bring sort of the people's demands to them so they can have their positions be informed. And so I think it's so important for civil society to be able to talk about the issues that are important to us, to be able to have Indigenous people in the room saying, okay, this is affecting our lives. And for us to know that, to talk about that, and to take a really strong stance to the negotiators, but I think even more importantly to the media in our respective countries, and through things like this, taking the message back home to the people that we are able to speak to, and the people who care about the issues. So I think there's a really important role of translation to be played there. I call it, I've always called it this like giant game of telephone. It's a really, the game telephone where you pass a message on, and then by the time it gets around the circle, the message is totally warped. Well, it's kind of like that with COP. COP, I feel, it's a giant battle of story. Something happens in the negotiating halls. By the time it ripples out to the rest of the world, the message can be totally skewed. And so it's so important for us to be here to be able to see the truth and tell the truth as clearly as possible. So that's one of the things that I do is helping ENGOs to coordinate their media presence, and to just have a better handle on the issues and more collective understanding. Because if we're splintered in our understanding, then governments can do whatever they want. So we have a huge accountability role to play.
Excellent. Thank you, Anjali.
Yeah.
And thank you, Patricia. If there are other people with questions, please chime in the chat box there. Somebody has asked about the recording, sent me a message asking about the recording. And so this is, as you can probably see, this is being recorded, and it will go up on the Sierra Club BC YouTube page in the next few days. So you can look out for it there and then share it out to, you know, if there's other people who you know who had to miss this because of the timing, you can send it out to them, and we'll be sending it out as well. Anjali, so to follow up on what you're just saying and what Patricia was asking, I'm curious about how many more days do you have there, and is there anything that you're looking forward to?
Yeah, so it's actually been a week already. It's a 2-week conference, so we're on day 6 of 10. So the first week was, the negotiations were pretty slow getting off the ground, and so this COP, a little bit of the context around it, as most of you probably know, the COP was actually scheduled to be held in Santiago, Chile, and because of the domestic unrest, it was moved very last minute to Madrid, and that actually had a huge impact on civil society participation and even negotiator participation. So things kind of got off to a chaotic start, and they weren't really in full swing till like day 4 or something. So I do think this COP is going to run pretty late. Like, I don't think it's going to end on Friday. I think it's going to end on either Saturday or Sunday. And yeah, so I have 5 days left. Days at the COP are crazy. You don't really sleep because you're basically trying to do several things. You're trying to track what the governments are doing and track the negotiations and make sure you're getting a really clear and truthful picture of what's happening. You're trying to meet with your various constituencies. So as I mentioned, I'm part of the Anglo constituency, but I'm also a Canadian at the COP. The Canadians have our own meeting. So there's the Canadian delegation daily meeting. Then there's briefings with negotiators. So twice during the COP, Canadian delegates get to meet with our negotiators and transfer our concerns and our issues, which is a really important space. Then there's briefings with the COP presidency, where we get to go and do the same thing with the COP presidency, tell them our concerns. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. My day, it doesn't start at 5 a.m. because usually it ends at like 3 a.m. So, you know, we get like a good 4 to 5 hours every night.
Excellent. So as you can probably see, there's a question here from Jay. I'm going to see if I can unmute you, Jay, so you can go ahead and ask it if you'd like. Go ahead.
Okay, hello. If you can hear me anyways.
Yeah, we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, good. No, meeting after meeting, people, hundreds, thousands of people traveling around the world to meetings, and the COP, the climate change COP is just the first one, just a recent example, but what is there anything about carbon credits? So when a government sends 100 people to a meeting, should they be purchasing carbon credits for that? You know, I mean, is that something that's ever even discussed at this meeting, the carbon footprint of these meetings?
Great, good question. Thank you, Jay.
Good question, Jay. That is a big concern. Conferences are not low carbon events. And I think, I don't know, there's a few layers to that. So yes, carbon credits are purchased, and we as consumers can do that now through, you know, when you purchase a flight, you can purchase offsets or you can purchase credits towards offsets. So there is that individual level to it. And I think the host country purchases a bunch of offsets because every year it's hosted by a different country. I honestly don't know how it worked this year because of the rapid change in venue. So I know that that's a general thing that happens. This year is kind of a special case for everything. On a bit of a higher level, it's kind of, yeah, it's a lot of people traveling, and it's kind of seen as a necessary like activity, because there's so much important work that happens in these settings that honestly, if this conference took place online, say we tried to have a carbon neutral conference and we did a whole online thing, I really think that participation and the voices of some of the most marginalized people would be left out of the conversation. And by having programs where there's funding for these people to make it here and to have their physical presence here, and for them to be able to have their stories amplified by, you know, us as Canadians, for example, it really performs a very, very crucial role. So there is a fine balance there of like really, really important work being done that needs to happen in person. And yeah, we are emitting a lot of carbon. And there's a lot, I will say there's a lot of green initiatives that do happen at these conferences. So I think they went paperless this year. So, you know, in previous conferences, there's been, you know, they hand out a daily program to everybody who wants it. That's just a big stack of paper. This year, everything's paperless. So I think for the past couple years, they've been ramping down the paper. And I think in the negotiations as well, they're doing a better job of incorporating technology so that negotiators have to be less reliable on paper. And things like they don't give out disposable food containers and stuff anymore. So yeah, that kind of balances it up. It's a fine balance.
Thanks, Anjali. Good question. I think that's probably something on a lot of people's minds for those of you, Anjali, who are traveling and doing this work. And I couldn't agree more. I mean, I really see these kinds of conferences as probably the best use of our fossil fuels. I mean, we have to solve this problem. So thank you.
Yeah.
We're getting close to being out of time, so I'm going to. There are a couple more questions coming in. I'm gonna see if this has been answered already.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Sorry, Galen. I'm preempting here. I'm reading these questions. There's some I can answer pretty quick here.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll just take the XR question and then the NDC question, answer those really quickly, and then you can ask the last one.
Great.
So XR, Extinction Rebellion, is a really amazing movement. They are present here and they're doing actions kind of all over Madrid. And there is the hunger strike. I wouldn't say that's having an impact yet. However, the second week is where things really intensify. So stay tuned. I'll be posting tweets and posts and stuff of things that are going to happen this week. And NDCs. So Ted is asking about substantive discussion about aggressive NDC, more aggressive NDCs. So the NDCs are the nationally determined contributions, which are basically every country's voluntary contribution or voluntary target to emissions reductions agreed to in Paris. And there has been a lot of discussion around making them more ambitious. So there'll be a big announcement about that on Wednesday. However, it's very difficult because we have to avoid the kind of thing that happened in Paris, where a bunch of countries got together. So back in Paris, the global target was 2 degrees of warming. A bunch of countries got together and they were like, we're gonna go further than that and we're gonna make it 1.5, which is amazing. Like amazing to ramp up the ambition of that global target. So it was a big, you know, Canada led that charge. Canada was at the head of the 1.5 coalition. Lot of press and photo ops, and Canada got called a climate leader, and you know, it was this whole like Canada's back post-Harper era. And most of the countries that were leading the 1.5 charge were the countries whose NDCs were actually, or the gap between what they were actually doing and their targets were the furthest. Canada being a prime example. Like our actual climate emissions reductions plan is nowhere close to our share of 1.5 degrees, let alone being more ambitious. So it's very kind of dicey to be careful around photo op type stuff like countries being like, yes, we're going to be even more ambitious with our NDCs. You have to look at what their climate plans actually say, and you have to take a really closer look at the critiques of those. So I'll be posting about that after the announcement on Wednesday. Stay tuned.
Great. And I think that looks like our last question, and we're about out of time, so that's perfect. Is there anything else you want to add before we wrap up?
I think the bottom line message, my title at Sierra Club is Climate Justice Campaigner. And so to me, climate justice is what I'm here to fight for. And to me, the bottom line of climate justice is, and it's a question that continues to eat at me, which is how do we find it in ourselves to really stand for justice in a time where it might not be in our best interests. And climate change is the ultimate issue of the commons. And I think it's calling upon some really uncomfortable things for us, because for Canada to do its fair share to the global community requires us to acknowledge our historical role, our current role, and it requires us to accept hardship so that other people's lives can be better. And that's something that I constantly question. Are we ready to do that? I think we are, but I just encourage us to grapple with that.
Definitely. Thank you, Anjali. Thank you so much for being there. It's a huge undertaking, a huge trip that you're making, and obviously just holding so much new relationships, all these meetings that you're describing that you're going to, all the NGO coordinating work that you're doing. It's amazing, and I hope you're able to get some rest along the way.
Thank you. This is so important to me to be able to communicate with you guys. So please tweet at me or write to me. Or, let's keep the conversation going. Thank you so much for facilitating, Galen.
Mm-hmm. And I'll just ask everyone to please amplify Anjali's work on social media, on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter for this final week. You can go find her through the Sierra Club BC on any of those platforms, and please share those. That's one way we can show solidarity and appreciation for the work that Anjali is doing, and it's so awesome to have us as Sierra Club BC supporters represented there. So thanks again, and good luck, and we'll be following you.
Thank you so much to all of you.
Okay, and what time is it there?
It's 10.
All right.
I think it's time for dinner.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.
Bye.